Many thanks for letting me do my presentation today. First of all, I'm graduating in the next month from Universidad Internacional SEC, so this is very much my first international conference presentation. So I'm very glad for letting me have the chance to do it today. And second of all, I'm going to be a lawyer and an advocate by profession next month, but I'm more of a legal philosopher at heart. So my presentation is going to be very theoretical in some aspects. So let's go. Let me share my screen. All right. So as you can see, my presentation is called Family, Property, and Inheritance, Institutions for Civilization and Their Enemies. And all this is my information. First of all, I would like to talk about civilization and order. And when I was writing this paper, I thought to myself, how is civilization defined? And I looked at Merriam-Webster's dictionary. The definition for civilization was the cultural characteristic of a particular time and place, and the stage of cultural development of which writing and keeping of written records is attained. This is a very simple definition, but when you see that civilization is actually something along the lines of culture and time and place, and something that is kind of ordered by culture, you tend to look at the definition of order. And again, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it as the arrangement or sequence of our objects of our events. So you see, when you look at time in a civilization, you are actually looking at some kind of order, an order in time. Also, there are other definitions, so all of order, which all have the same general idea about arrangement, about some kind of fairness in the way they are arranged. And at last, you see order is also the state of peace, freedom from confused or unruly behavior, and respect for law and proper authority. So you see, civilization needs order in order to be civilized, and order needs law in order to be ordered, or at least some kind of law, which is fairness, which is justice. And civilization and order are related. They can be applied to human social customs, to forms, to knowledge, and they need to be arranged in an adequate way, which means, of course, that we're trying to apply the concept of justice, which is to give each to its own, which is a classical concept of justice from Roman law. And on the other hand, you see that there are certain elements of common good and institutions in civilizations and in order. And so these are, for example, material, social, cultural, political institutions, which help for the development of the people who are participating in that civilization, in that society, in that order. And of course, when there are institutions which are ordered for the common good, there needs to be some kind of law, or at least a legal order that is defined as the positive sum of valid laws and hierarchies in relation to each other, which are ruled by rules in a country. Wait a second. Okay. I'm having some troubles with my presentation. And that's when I realized that there are certain institutions which are which are part of what is called the spontaneous order. You see, F.A. Hayek, the Austrian economist, he defined this spontaneous order as something that is part of society adaptation to their circumstances, in which they grow by themselves, they arise by themselves, they exist by themselves because they are the result of human action, and they help people and they help individuals to live in a more ordered way. And so you see, the thing with family, property, and inheritance is that these are some of the best examples of spontaneous order institutions, because they arise and they are discovered freely under natural circumstances, and they can be understood rationally by any person. So in that way, they are as spontaneous because pretty much all civilizations have them, and all civilizations have developed some kind of family and property and inheritance institution, and because they can be understood as rationally as they can be, so they are part of natural law. And now we can go to the respective definitions of family, property, and inheritance. Family property is understood as the rights and attribution of an individual person. That is the entitlement he has over the goods and rights he possesses, the total control of the services that can be derived from a good, as the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises defined as well. And in the same fashion, family can be defined by another scholar, actually a legal scholar from Spain called Miguel Ayuso, who defines family as the community that is constituted by for everyday life according to nature, and that is arising from the cellular society born from a mutual agreement of heterosexual marriage. I know there are some other concepts of family, but this one is the most natural, this one is the most traditional, and pretty much all societies and all civilizations have pretty much come to that same definition in history. And a family is a very important institution for civilization because, as another scholar, Lou Rockville, said, is an anarchical institution, meaning that there is no need for the state to actually promote it and to actually define it, because it exists from human nature, and it refines and develops itself from sexual norms, and with it, it develops civilization. Again, means a spontaneously ordered institution, and it answers to the needs of human nature and allows for the development of individuals and community. At last, from family and from property, you have the institution of inheritance, which is a combination of both family and property. And again, I'm using the definition of Mises, which is a human device where virtually each property owner is directly or indirectly the legal successor of the person that has previously acquired property, creating a logical and consequent succession order from which an owner or his or her natural heir are a descendant of another owner that had the previous ownership of a certain good. And so the family, as the institution, as the order institution that it is, it actually promotes the succession of property from one generation to the other. Now, since this Congress is about the concept of Ubuntu and natural rights, natural law, I actually looked up to the concept of Ubuntu since I hadn't included my original paper. And actually, it is the African values and practices that make an authentic individual human as part of a larger and more significant world, which is relational, communal, societal, environmental, and spiritual. And so you see that family, property, and inheritance are part of that Ubuntu concept, because family is a group institution formed by various individuals who share a family bond through blood or through law. Property is another institution that needs for society and for relations to exist. And so the wealth that one acquires is actually succeeded and is actually transmitted by another person in that same community. And at last, inheritance is the application of property to family, as property can be transmitted through family lines in order to preserve it after the death of a person. And now we go to the concept of institutions and natural law. And I am saying that these institutions are part of natural law because they can be understood by by human reason. They are ordered by human reason. And you don't need a particular kind of force except for your own reason, your own spirit, to understand these institutions. And since they are linked all by themselves, you see that there's another logical way to understand them. And they are also part of tradition because they answer to an spontaneous order that was built on several lifetimes from trial and error. At the beginning, you had a particular kind of tribal family, and now you have a more reduced but more perfect way of family through larger families than through nuclear families. On the other hand, you also had a more primitive understanding of property as the one that you should and could keep by force. And now you have property that is recognized through laws and through a legal order that makes property to be legitimate. And inheritance, again, you applied both concepts, legally defined family and legally defined family bonds through which you can succeed in the property and in the ownership of a good that your ancestors had. And this is actually understood through reason. That's why it is part of natural law, because it is something that is pretty much self-explanatory to everyone. Everyone can understand what family, what property, or what inheritance are without looking at the legal definition of it. And actual legal definitions have to follow that reasonability. But since we already have the definitions of family property and inheritance, we shall look at the enemies of these institutions, because each institution that exists has some kind of adversity to be applied, to be recognized. And so most revolutionary political philosophies and legal philosophies try to destroy these concepts of family property and inheritance because they are against their ultimate wishes. And actually, when I was researching for this paper, I created my own definition of revolution. And so for me, a revolution is pretty much the same what is in physics and astronomy. It kind of tries to return the order, return civilization to a state of nature in which there is no reason, in which there is no order, in which there is no civilization, and there's only ignorance and obscurity, irrationality, and force. And so a revolution would mean entropy, disorder, and chaos. With that chaos, you couldn't have the development of institutions such as family or property, because no one would understand what family or property means, because they would be in the dark of ignorance. And a revolution actually targets family, property, and inheritance because they are some of the most important institutions for civilization, because they are actually the founding stones for civilization. When there's family and where there's property, you know that there's going to be civilization in a while. And first, revolution targets goes against the family. And here I use the concept of some libertarian traditional Catholic scholars, which is kind of very interesting because most libertarians are they are very secular, and on the other hand, most traditionalist Catholic scholars are very religious. And so, first, a revolution targets family because it wants to eternize itself. And when you have a family, you have a competing loyalty to your family than the one you have to the state. And usually the state, when it's formed by, or when it is taken by a revolutionary group, it tries to get the absolute loyalty of the people it is ruling. And when you have a family and when you have a community, you will have your loyalties divided by your loyalty to the state and your loyalty to your family, to your community. And the problem about families, and families have a particular hierarchy. Families have a particular order that is not where everyone is not equal. You have different rights and obligations for each member. You have a father, you have a mother, you have the sons, you have daughters, and each one has a different role to fulfill. And so they are not equal in rights and obligations as most revolutionary tendencies would like to, as they try to impose equality for all. And the revolution itself actually hates and tries to dissolve the family because, as you know, by creating this by trying to impose this equality under the family, you are actually destroying the first body, the first community that would try to make your loyalties compete against the state, because you cannot be both loyal to the state and to your family. Because the state, and actually the totalitarian state, the absolute state, tries to have your absolute and your total loyalty, but your family also needs for you to be loyal. And when there are certain tendencies and certain ideologies and certain philosophies that promote equality through revolution, you will have this competition from family and from the state. And again, I'm using von Mises' definition, and he said that the proposals to transform sexual relations, that is to transform the institution of family, have been long attached to the socialization of producer goods. The marriage would disappear with private property. Socialism would not only falsely promises economic welfare, but also universal happiness in it. And that means that whenever there's this kind of philosophy that promotes equality and the destruction of the family and the dissolution of the family, it is not only trying to promote the end of the family, but its ultimate end is to promote economic equality, which is something that is a goal, but can have to be understood that as long as there are differences in society, there cannot be absolute equality for everyone. And so after revolution targets the family, revolution also targets property. And here I look at Marxist thought because it is one of the most clear in its intentions. And at first I use another definition by a traditional Catholic thinker, Dr. Plinio Correa de Oliveira, who says that one of the goals of revolution is economic equality. Nothing belongs to no one. Everything belongs to the collective. It would be the suppression of private property, of each one's right to the integrity of their work and to the election of their professional activities. And so if there's no family, if there's no loyalty to anyone, of course, they would not be at the ownership of anything, because no one would actually understand what's theirs or what's not theirs. And in the Communist Manifesto, there's actually a call for the bourgeois family to disappear as a consequence of the full disappearance of the complement of private property, and for both to disappear when capital would disappear. And so when a revolutionary philosophy targets family, it's also targeting property. And at last, the end of that is to create a disorder in which there is no framework for property to be transmitted from one generation to the other within a family. And in another work of Marxist, of Friedrich Engels, which is called The Origin of Family, Private Property, and the State, he stated that in most cases, man has to work his way through life to maintain his family, at least among poorer social classes. The way he gets a higher social position without any special legal privilege. For the family, he is the bourgeois, and woman represents the proletariat. Family, instead of a collective tribe, had become the industrial unit of society. The coming communist revolution will reduce any care for inheritance as the minimal changing part, at least the great part of the permanent and inheritable wealth capital goods as social property. That means some revolutionary schools of thought, such as Marxism, try to destroy family and to destroy private property by destroying inheritance. And so when there's no need for property to be transmitted, there's no need for family. When there's no family, there's no need for to accumulate wealth and to transmit it to the next generations. And when there's no property, there's no need for a family to provide for or to have descendants to transmit your property to the others. And that is because revolutions, the revolutionary schools of thought understand that there's a clear natural law relation between family, property, and inheritance, because they form a close order in which they are all related and in which they all have a meaning and purpose. And by identifying this order, by identifying this connection between family, property, and inheritance as institutions, by destroying one of them, by targeting one of them or attacking one of them, you're actually attacking the other thing. If, for example, you put higher taxes in succession law, or for example, if you don't promote the formation of families in your country, or if you are trying to socialize the property in a country, you're actually targeting the other two institutions. Because if you target the property, there's no need for families to be formed, because you are not accumulating wealth for anyone. If you are attacking family, you are attacking property and inheritance, because you don't have anyone to transmit your property when you're dead. And if you're attacking inheritance, you're attacking family and property, because, well, there's no need to form a family if you cannot transmit your property to others. And so if this is understood as widely, as reasonably as it can be by the principles of natural law, it should be applied in legislation as well. But the problem is that many political governments in the world are actually understanding that, and since they are influenced by these revolutionary schools of thought, they are actually targeting through legislation this natural law order of family, property, and inheritance. And they're using legislation because this is what Hayek called the main tool for deliberate change in modern society, because it can impose this constructivism, rationalism that is used by these revolutionary schools of thought. I would go on with this idea, but I think that the idea of constructivism, rationalism, and legislation can be used for another paper, for another essay. So in the end, legislation, and especially in the Western world, is used to attack the family and property and inheritance by making it more difficult for people to have a family, or by simply diluting the concept of family. Also, it is attacking property by making it harder for people to have property, and it is attacking inheritance by making taxes and by making other kinds of legislation to be harder for people to actually transmit their property to their descendants. And when that happens, you're actually destroying civilizations, because you're destroying the fundamental and the foundational stones of what the civilized order is for the common folk. I mean, if you don't have a family, then what's your purpose to have property? And if you don't have descendants, then what's what are you having a family? What are you accumulating property? And so on and so forth. And this is the reason I think that, at least when you try to understand natural law concepts, you need to understand them in the best way to have your feet in the ground, that there are institutions that you can see everywhere, like family or property, that the institutions are actually the ones that keep civilization afloat and that make civilization as it is. So this is it. If anyone wants to read the paper that on this presentation was based from, I have the link in here. I can copy it for you, and my contact links are my email in here and my social media handle, especially for Twitter, if you want to follow me on Twitter. So yeah, that's it. Thanks. Thank you a lot for having heard my presentation today.
Thank you very much also for the insightful presentation. Does the audience have any question?
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I think many, perhaps most people here are very sympathetic to the idea that totalitarian attack on the family is not a good thing, but they might also be sympathetic to redistributive taxation. So the question is how to combine this value of family, inheritance, and property with some redistributive taxation. So how much leeway are you going to give to that idea of redistribution, if any?
Okay, yeah, this is a very good question. And as you know, there are certain principles and parameters in order to make taxation as fair, as just as it could be. And so, for example, some totalitarian societies, like for example, the USSR or Nazi Germany, they actually try to promote a general taxation for only the state to have ownership and property of capital goods. And that's the problem, because if only a particular entity has that ownership, it means that no one else has. As for your question itself, I think that the best way to apply a redistributive taxation in order to promote actually the ownership of property by families, and then by to make them their descendants succeed in their ownership, is by only targeting the institutions that have way too much property. I mean, you cannot and you should not tax a family for having like a normal amount of property. I mean, uh, there are certain, in my country at least, we have a certain top and bottom of the amount of property that a family or a person can have in order to be taxed in a certain amount. And so I think those principles could be applied as well. I mean, you must promote families to have property, but you don't have to promote for corporations or for a particular people without a family, for example, to have a lot of property. Another idea I have is that if you have a certain amount of property, in order not to be taxed, you should prove that you have a family, you have a wife, you have kids, because if not, what's the purpose of the property you're acquiring and you're accumulating?
Okay, thank you for your response. This marks the end of today's session. As we conclude, I would like to